Aloha nui kako, Joe Souza here, and I'm so excited because I'm actually able to sit down with Matt Dahlberg and talk about tone. So tone talk.
Tone talk.
I like that. Actually, giving a little bit more insight to different soundboards and ultimately the tone that we're able to create to help with the player's experience as far as the tone you're looking for as a player, whether it be brighter, warmer, more volume, projection. We can start to nail down some of those finer points that come with the different soundboards that we're able to build from as a builder.
Yeah, well, it's a super subjective thing, and so I'm excited to add some objectivity to it.
Yeah. And a lot of this is going to be based off of some of the experiences that we found as far as what tone we're able to create that's kind of outside of the box for the ukulele, especially when traditionally we built from koa, and koa, of course, being that kind of tried and true soundboard. For many years, when people come on the tour or if I'm at a festival and somebody kind of pins me down and asks me, is koa a good soundboard, right? It's kind of like a loaded question, right? Because I'd be shooting myself in the foot if I didn't say koa was a good soundboard, right? Because it is. It has its tone. It has its place. But ultimately, it's what is the sound that the player is looking for.
Exactly. Yeah.
Pinning that down.
Yeah, I've got a lot of students in the people always ask me, what's the best tone wood? Like, what's the best ukulele? And there's no one best. It depends on the individual and their needs as a player. Right. And so one of my favorite things about private lessons is getting to know individuals so that I can then essentially tell them what I think will bring the best results on their ukulele journey. And two different people will have completely different needs, just like they're completely different people. And so I think sometimes we get so obsessed with how the wood looks or whatever else, and we don't think, what style of tone am I looking for as a player, and what can bring that out. And that's what I'm excited to talk about here today with these, why you as a builder pick to use certain woods, and then for me as a player, what I find works best for certain types of sounds.
Right. So having those conversations with your students, like, hey, I hear your style, I hear what you're looking for, or what you're trying to achieve, and it's pretty much how do we get there?
Yes.
So, to kind of maybe start off looking at the different alternative woods outside of koa is, the one that comes to mind first, typically, and I think this just translates through the years of stringed instruments, is spruce.
Yes.
And the different varieties of spruce, especially the ones that we have access to, being, the North American source of different tone woods. Ideally, either Sitka spruce, which then comes from, of course, our West Coast, or typically from the Rockies. On the alternative side, of course, there's the Adirondack spruce, which comes from the east side of North America, to kind of a hybrid spruce. And I know this is a spruce that you're more familiar with, which is, and we didn't coin the term, it was actually our supplier who coined the term Lutz spruce, which in turn is from the Rockies, but it grows on the east side of the Rockies.
Interesting, yeah.
So it has more of a east side Adirondack tendency, even though it's a Sitka spruce. And then just kind of seeing what tones we were able to achieve with just spruce as the alternative tone. Yeah. But ultimately is what is the tone, right? What sound are we able to achieve? And that's what really shocked me the most was here was a tone that was one different than koa, maybe not as bright, but bright.
Yeah, very articulate is what I've noticed, and I really enjoy playing with spruce. I'm a solo player. I like to play more instrumentals, and so koa can be. It's almost like you could use a positive word and a negative word to mean the same thing, right? So koa is complex, but that also could be described as muddy, depending on your interests or wants. And I don't think koa ukes are muddy, but when you compare it to spruce, spruce gives that articulation, that individual note separation, which you could also describe as simple in a more negative way, right? And so it's just depending on what your needs are as a player. So I've noticed spruce has always given that really good individualistic character of each note, so that if you're playing chord melody style or something like that, it gives you really crystal clear articulation, and when what you're doing with the instrument, it will bring out. I've also noticed though that spruce, sometimes you have to play a little bit harder to draw out some of that sound. Is spruce, comparing spruce to like other tone woods that are, options, is spruce kind of the stiffest of them compared to like cedar and redwood and others, or,
It is. And with respect to spruce, especially when we look at like old growth spruce, and old growth is kind of termed as wood that tends to have tighter growth lines. And how spruce is graded is through, and other tone woods, is through how many growth lines are there per an inch. So let's say 2A spruce, kind of the more baseline spruce, maybe there's 14, 12 to 14 growth lines per an inch. But as we start to get to the higher grades, like for example, the spruce that I bought today, we're looking at like 40 growth lines per an inch. So in the rule book, it would be like, well, that's like 5A, or master grade as like the most supreme old growth spruce that we could get. So to kind of reflect back onto your question is, yes, the more growth lines per an inch, the stiffer the wood is. But then from a builder's point of view, you're looking at, well, you have a stiffer soundboard, which in turn, you could take the thickness down. And by making it a bit thinner, now you start to walk this balance, right, between thickness, mass that gets created through thickness, to then thinner, which ultimately, potentially, is more elasticity, more resonance, which again, translates to tone. So you can go thinner with some of those tighter grained spruces and still have, an instrument that doesn't necessarily implode or collapse on itself, right?
Spruce has been, one of the reasons it's my favorite is I like to really be able to dig in when I'm playing and not have the instrument sort of blow out. And spruce feels like I can put as much energy as I want into it and it doesn't give out. And that's also another favorite feature of mine with Kanileʻa ukulele is your instruments have that sort of resilience to the player. It doesn't feel like you touch them and they're already at the max end of volume and tone. You as a player, you can dig in and you can actually adjust the tonality with your playing, and spruce gives like another layer to that. But when so I've got a spruce Kanileʻa, I also have a cedar one.
Right.
And when I got these ukes, I didn't really know much about it. It's just from our talks, and you would describe like the cedar being a sweeter tone. And in playing it, I gravitated towards that being my low G ukulele, because I noticed it almost sounded like with cedar everything was compressed compared to spruce, in a good way where it's sweeter, but when I play it softer, I get more, but if I play it harder, it doesn't give me the same response as spruce. Do you know the reason why, spruce tends to have a little bit more of that resilience, while, spruce has more of a sweetness, but less kind of top end, if that makes sense?
I think at some point it boils back towards elasticity, because cedar tends to be more elastic. It has greater elasticity, which in turn is then going to translate tonally. So it may give you more upfront, but maybe a little less when you really dig in. Alternatively, of course, when we look at spruce tends to not have the same amount of elasticity. Now, of course, again, comparing it to koa, it does have more elasticity than koa. But when we look at spruce, it tends to be a little bit stiffer, which in turn can work in our favor tonally, because now when we initially hit the string, not necessarily digging into the instrument, you're going to get a pretty consistent sound. Maybe that's a better way of kind of framing it, consistent sound. But then when you really dig in and you want more from it, to say you can get more from it from a player. And I wouldn't say there's like a set ceiling, because ultimately there is, but the range that spruce gives you is a bit more dynamic.
And I like when I'm playing low G, I tend to do more finger style. I tend to finger pick more and tend to play softer. And when I'm playing with my high G, which is spruce, I really like strumming and kind of aggressive strumming, and they just kind of fit those. And I've tried flipping them, and they both still sound wonderful, but I'm missing kind of the other wood sets' strengths. And and do you have some spruce here? And maybe
I did. So I've got some Lutz spruce. I brought some Adirondack, and I brought some Sitka. So I'm gonna grab the Sitka first.
Yeah.
And the reason why is this was kind of the first alternative tone wood.
Yeah.
You know, Sitka spruce seemed to be the most accessible initially. Lutz spruce wasn't even a thought. You know, it may have surfaced, but nobody really seen it differently until today, where we start to identify it differently. And Adirondack spruce has always kind of been the holy grail to say, you know, and with respect to Martin and what they did with their, you know, with their guitars, as far as bringing Adirondack spruce and what they had access to basically on the East Coast, and the popularity, of course, growing, which in turn, accessibility and popularity kind of led to where it is today, where again, it's one of the highly considered spruces, right? But looking at Sitka first, and one of the things with Sitka, it tends to be very consistent. In this case, the growth lines are really, really tight. Yeah. And again, looking into that grading system. But then ultimately, it gives us a nice, consistent result from a builder's point of view. Right?
And do you think that translates to the tone as well? That there's a visual connection to the, you know, the consistency of the wood, giving a consistency to tone as well, where a more consistent looking grain will result in a tone that is more predictable or more, you know, articulate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it beyond the obvious, like, yes, it's spruce, and with respect to Sitka spruce, its consistency led to its popularity, right? Yeah. So today, and I'm going to say this kind of broadly, but generally speaking, Sitka spruce is the most popular spruce that guitars are being made from today. Adirondack spruce is harder to get. Lutz spruce seems to be almost elusive too, just because of maybe access and availability. So Sitka spruce seems to be the first choice outside of some of the you know, European spruces and things that come from Europe. Because of that, and because of its consistency, it's led to spruce being like the sought after, Sitka spruce being the sought after tone wood. Now, kind of reflecting, because we talked about it briefly, is looking at Adirondack. And the piece that we had was a piece that was actually been edge glued already. It's already been laid out and joined to become a soundboard. And in this case, this is a bear claw, which pretty much doesn't mean a bear when it clawed the tree. It's more that the grain is almost like curl, to say how curl would be associated with maple, koa, and other tone woods. Bear claw in many ways is almost kind of like a curly spruce. And in this case, Adirondack spruce. So Adirondack being rare, bear claw Adirondack kind of putting it into another level of rareness. But the reason why, you know, I brought the Adirondack is one, to show its beauty, but also to talk about its tone, because it is denser. It's denser than the Sitka. So that density then allows us to then make the soundboard a little thinner. The thinner soundboard translates tonally. So these are like finer points, you know, builder points, but those are key points when we start to look at the final tone of the instrument. And so that's why I brought the Adirondack, mostly because of its established tone, right? You know, this is
you can
like
really see the difference too between those.
And you can kind of see between the Lutz spruce, right, and the growth lines, and then the Sitka, right? So you can kind of see the differences, right? But ultimately, those subtle differences do play a big effect on the final tone of the instrument. And that lets us jump right into kind of the Lutz spruce, which again, you're familiar with, right? And with respect to Lutz spruce, it found its way too, because it has the Adirondack tendencies, being on the East Coast or the east side of the Rockies to then, how does that translate tonally, and how does that translate to a builder too? and seeing that it tends to be a little bit stiffer, which in turn is very much like the Adirondack.
Yeah.
It allows our soundboard to be a little bit thinner, and then ultimately it translates tonally to the instrument too, which I think that's where we found Lut spruce, like it really found its place too. And in this kind of ball of spruce, to say that comes from wherever in the Americas, there's this kind of curveball that gets thrown to us as a musical instrument community, outside of builder and player, is now we have pieces that go through this process of torrefication and or thermal modification, or there's a bunch of other ways to recognize this tone wood that is now changing, right? It's
Treated
changing.
in some way.
Yeah. And it's gained in popularity, and I can see why. One, stability. Two, tone. That the workpieces, because it goes through this process, and maybe just to kind of shed some light on this process of torrefication, it's literally getting these workpieces, these spruce pieces that were intended to become a guitar soundboard, ukulele soundboard, and they put it in this kind of special oven. If we see the oven as almost like a hyperbaric chamber, right? It's really unique. And what's happening what's happening to the wood is the wood is being dried to a point where it gets to 0% moisture.
Wow.
Which literally, let's just say from a builder standpoint, that's impossible.
Yeah.
There's no way that we could get enough dry air, enough heat, because you're going to have to introduce heat at some point to be able to get it to dry to that point, to be able to bring the wood down to that low of a moisture content. So in that, with torrefication, or with this process of thermally modifying on a cellular level, they're able to remove all the oxygen, which in turn takes out one of the legs of the fire tetrahedron, one of the key points in fuel for fire, which then in turn allows the wood to then be dried to a higher temperature, to 0% moisture, then let acclimate back, and that wood then acclimates back to normal moisture content, on average 7 to 8% moisture content, to then now become a guitar or become a musical instrument. And it's not brand new. For those who follow Kanileʻa, you've seen it on our 2017 Platinum, which had a walnut with a terrified spruce top. But we're seeing tonally what it's doing on the instrument. And, it's hard to say what is your favorite, because you can't really say what's your favorite.
Depends what your needs are in that moment. Yeah.
Exactly. What tone are you looking for?
Yeah.
So in that, it's what tone are you looking for? Then from there, a favorite can be found. And with respect to this torrefication process, the result ultimately is you have a piece that sounds better, potentially sounds like an instrument that's like 50 years old at an early age.
Yeah.
So...
And so to expand on that just a little bit, so with spruce, it's the notorious wood for opening up, right?
Yes.
A brand new spruce instrument is always described as sounding a little bit tight.
Right.
And then as you play it, it opens up. And you mentioned like the years. And so a question I have is, to my understanding, it's not the time as much as it's been the energy played.
Yes.
Because the wood, as it vibrates, the cells or whatever kind of get realigned in a way that allows it to vibrate better. Is that what sort of happens? And with the torrefied spruce, is that process sort of expedited because everything's been broken down and rebuilt in a way? Or what contributes to that vintage sound that we describe when we say an old spruce top, for instance?
I think it's a combination. It's not just one or two even. It's a combination of several things. And yes, for a spruce instrument, it does have to be kind of broken in, right? And there's hints and tricks out there as far as like put it in front of a speaker and play classical music, play a wide range of...
Make devices now that you can put on the bridge that will vibrate.
These tone enhancers, or, and I get it. Ultimately, it's what's happening to the wood, right? And so, yes, it is from the act, to say, of playing, right? Or strumming or picking, and pretty much the wood learning its new job.
Yeah.
You know, it grew for years in the forest, it fell, it ultimately becomes a musical instrument. Now, what is its new job? Or what are we asking of the wood to do? So as it's figuring out that new job, then of course the sound and the richness of the tone is going to be opening up, right? In that, you know, what is happening on a cellular level? And I can kind of see this too, just from experience. You know, when we start to look at seasons, right? The wood is constantly expanding and contracting. It's living through seasons. Now, in Hawaii, maybe it's not too drastic. Our seasons are like, is it winter, is it summer? What's the difference? Yeah, is it raining or is it not? Right? That's kind of the difference. Where when we look at seasons over a lifetime and the instrument going through different seasons, different changes, expanding, contracting, playing along the way. Whereas torifying, I wouldn't say is like front of the line pass at Disneyland, but it does give the wood the opportunity to then live through seasons.
Interesting.
And that's what we see the most, because when we see a piece that's torified, it's it looks vintaged. You know, it takes on that more kind of amber, kind of golden color, to say, as if the piece was just sitting out and spending its life 50 years, even though it wasn't like a musical instrument, to say.
And the result of that is better sustain overall of the instrument, more responsive attack, right? Because the wood is going to both be more easily to stimulate to vibrate because of that process, and then it will continue to vibrate for longer, right? A newer spruce top, that's kind of what the tightness is you kind of, it's more reluctant to start vibrating and stops vibrating a little bit quicker. And it's just a little bit, but I mean, I've got a Kanileʻa built in 2016, and every year it sounds better, and it's a Sika spruce top, and I think it's now gone through many seasons, just as you described.
Right. And it will continue. You know, and with respect to some of the older builders or instruments that were built, you know, through the years, their instrument is going through the seasons. You know, it's been going through that change of moisture, playing, cellular level changes, right, that ultimately reflects on tone. So now that we've kind of grouped spruce and we looked at it through as a species, but then also through some of the processes that we're able to do today as kind of the modern day builder, let's take a look at redwood. And knowing that redwood has carved its way as far as tone and uniquenesses too in that, where, for example, you know, we're able to work with some old growth, again, looking at that tightness of growth lines, redwood, which interestingly enough is redwood logs, and especially of the time, most of the redwood and most of the moving of logs was via the waterways because they're so big and there's no way to move them. We didn't have, you know, the same technology or the same type of transportation that we do today. And these redwood logs, because of their size, didn't make it through the waterways and actually sank. And through the sinking process, it actually helped with seasoning these logs, basically putting them underwater for 100 years. Now going back and finding those logs and basically repurposing them to become musical instruments, which maybe wasn't their original intention. You know, these old growth logs may have been housing and or fence material, but because they're so sought after today, finding those pieces and then, of course, allowing them to become musical instruments. So cutting them in a very specific way. And we found that tonally, it's different. Yeah.
And how would you describe that compared to spruce, especially? So if we think of spruce as a really articulate and consistent sound, right? I think it's fair to say, right? What does redwood do differently that would make it an option, other than it visually looks quite different?
Right. You know, beyond the color and some of the grain structure, it's the best way to sum it up in a way, in one word, is it's stiffer. It's actually rigid comparatively to spruce. So it almost has less elasticity, if we see elasticity as a way of seeing how the wood vibrates, which in turn, it changes the tone. But in this case, these are pieces of redwood that are so tightly grained and so stiff that from a builder's point of view, we can then now take our soundboard even thinner, right? But in that, it becomes brittle too, because it is harder. So working around the pieces and understanding those pieces, because they can have a tendency to crack. They are brittle, yet they're soft. So you have to be careful, you know, as far as workbench and all those things, builder points. But ultimately, tonally, what we found, especially on a nylon string instrument. Now, I'm sure there will be more experiences for us in the future with steel string instruments, but what we found with nylon string instruments is it creates a pretty rich, dynamic tone.
A lot of complexity to it, right? It's got rich overtones and it just has a very full-bodied sound.
It does. And that's kind of early on, you know? And we've never got a chance to work with any torrefied redwood, and I don't know if there's any really that exists at this point, but I do know that the redwood and the sinker redwood that we've been building from, and it took learning, you know, as far as what are the subtleties, but it builds a really finely crafted instrument. So tonally, it tends to be a little bit brighter, a little bit more sustained even, which in turn can fit for a particular player.
Yeah, especially a player who might be, you know, more driven in that fingerstyle type of realm, and they want to get that sustain and draw each note out. And I got to play, I believe it was a redwood instrument a couple of years ago here when I was recording, and it was so different than the spruce, and it was a really cool process to kind of just experiment, because one of the tendencies that we have as players is when we play our ukulele, we get used to all of it, both the strengths and the weaknesses. And so when we switch to another ukulele, we try to fit the mold of those same strengths and weaknesses on the new ukulele. But if a strength of a previous uke is a weakness of the other one, it sounds worse. And on the flip side of that, if a strength of a new one was a weakness of your other, well, it takes some practice to trust that new instrument that it's going to do this thing well when another one maybe wouldn't have. And so it seems like the different woods can really contribute to that for players, and finding the right tone wood for the style that you're looking to play can be critical to getting that right match. And so with redwood, do you notice, like with the density, do you notice that you have a larger, different number of thicknesses that you use with that? Is it less consistent than spruce, where every piece of redwood feels more unique, or do you find that's still a pretty consistent process?
Well, you know, I mean, we dial in our thicknesses. So with respect to our thickness, it's like, what is the right thickness for redwood, right? And not necessarily does that mean that's the same thickness that we would do on a spruce. In that also, we've seen, especially like when we're doing some of our D series, we're doing it with a redwood top. And, you know, in my ear, I'm thinking, you know, this is like some of the best instruments that have come off of our workbench, you know, as far as tone. I mean, look-wise, it's stunning. You know, it's different. And I brought a piece, so at least we can take a look and compare between traditional redwood and some of the sinker redwoods. But when we try to describe sound is, what are we getting? More volume, more projection, which seems to be sought after, you know, and that's like, okay, well, what do those words translate to? Well, it's louder, you know, it's a louder instrument, right? Which some people, to them, that's the associated sound, right? Oh, I'm looking for something that's louder, you know. I may give up something, you know, I don't have another end to say if I'm going to be playing a specific piece, but then I do have something that's loud. You know, I may give up some sustain, which is fine. You know, I mean, different needs, exactly. But then when we start to look at the wood beyond the visual and really looking tonally what it's doing, it's ultimately creating a whole new experience, right, for a player. And how you're pointing out, kind of in your toolbox as a player, like, okay, that instrument, I know this is kind of the sweet spot for my style of playing is right in this area. And if you go and try and translate that onto a different instrument, not necessarily is that the sweet spot. It's like, well, it normally doesn't do that.
And you have to change what you do as a player to fit the instrument better,
Right.
which is a cool process in its own right. But,
That's true.
But one that's important to acknowledge. Sometimes, you might play a uke and then you go try one at a store or whatever. It's like, oh, I thought I'd like it more. It's like, well, a quick trial in the store wasn't enough to give you the nuances of the variation that uke had. But you said that there was a piece here to...
I brought a couple of samples of the redwoods.
Beautiful.
And the intent, of course, is just to show maybe how striking it is. So in this case,
Almost
that's...
looks like a walnut.
It does, right? And this is actually sinker redwood.
Wow.
So what's happening, on a cellular level is some of those different tannins that are in the wood going through that long-term seasoning or long-term drying, which in turn, even some of the minerals get picked up. That's happening, kind of at the bottom of the Columbia River.
Yeah.
And some of those different minerals surface too, which in turn, I brought, a traditional redwood, just so comparatively, it's striking
It's incredible.
the difference.
And would you say that this is a brighter tone overall, tends to be? Is it a denser wood than
is.
And so do you get this one thinner generally than
That's
the
the
non-sinker?
thing, which we can.
Yeah.
Now, the other side of it, it doesn't bend. So we can't, well, we've tried, but we can't do our true relief because the soundboard just doesn't want to bend the same way, right?
Interesting.
So from a builder's point of view, it set forth some challenges. But then it also brought in, like when we see those challenges as for what there are, as far as problem solving and being able to design and develop and grow further, it does allow us to bring an armrest on. So it brings some player comfort, but then it also allows the soundboard, in this case, a stiffer workpiece to then translate to a finger stylus who's looking for a brighter note, who's looking for some clarity even as they work their way up the fingerboard and not losing volume so much as we get into, 10th, 12th, 15th positions where those notes, they still ring and they still kind of have their place.
And they have a higher responsiveness, so the player doesn't have to dig in quite as hard to bring that forward, right? Because of the top and its thinness and its ability to vibrate. It's very cool.
Yeah, it is. And that's why I thought, bringing some of these woods, because it doesn't only encompass spruce, it doesn't only encompass redwood. In our case, we also have cedar, which in many ways has kind of found its way too. And we are all in agreement. Some of the best sounding instruments we made were from cedar.
Yeah.
Whether that combination and where it falls as far as back and sides, koa with a cedar top, walnut with a cedar top, or even some alternative cedars like Port Orford cedar, which is not even a cedar. It's a cypress, but it has a scent, which in turn cedars tend to be scented.
That is the best part of a cedar uke, is just smelling it.
Yeah, right. And those old, pencils, what was it, Choice, I think the brand name was, they were made from cedar and you could smell them as you're sharpening. But ultimately, cedar has its place too. And where that falls comparatively and differently is, and that's why I wanted to kind of hold cedar towards the end here, is kind of right in the middle between spruce and redwood. Here comes cedar that kind of pulls some of the qualities from both of those, right? So I brought a piece of cedar and we can take a look at it.
Yeah.
And it's
got beautiful grain too.
Yeah, beautiful grained cedar, which in turn, ultimately, tonally, what we're able to get from cedar is something that tends to have a little bit more volume than spruce, and a little bit more volume and a little bit more warmth and complexity in its tone too, which from a cedar uke player, you can hear the difference. You can understand that spruce has its place. Cedar has its place too.
Absolutely.
Right?
And as a player, when it's never a good idea to just say this is for you and this is for you, because every individual's different.
Yeah.
But if you're a player who tends to play really hard, spruce can oftentimes be a better fit because it allows you to dig in a bit more. But if you're a more delicate player and you play softer, cedar or even all the way to redwood is nice because it gives you a higher responsiveness. And then there's the flip side of that coin. If you're a softer player, you're not going to play really hard. So you don't necessarily need what spruce can do. And if you're a hard player, and you might not play super soft, in which case you won't even get the strengths of the redwood or the cedar. And so a really hard player might want a spruce, a really, really soft player might want a redwood, and somewhere in between can sit a cedar. And as a player, you can learn different techniques to fit the instrument, which in its own right is quite a lot of fun to explore an instrument. But it's fascinating because these are just the tops of the ukes. This isn't even talking about the sides and back, but it seems like this makes a bigger difference than the sides and back.
It does.
So
Experientially, I mean, there's some visual things that, and don't get me wrong, a Brazilian rosewood Adirondack spruce, that's a gorgeous instrument. It's beautiful, tonally and visually, right? In respect to some of the other woods that we use, maple, it found its place too.
I still can't believe that maple as a back and sides, obviously tried and true. But when I first got to play your all maple series, and as it was being handed to me, I had a mental note of like, oh boy, thinking about maple as a top, and it plays wonderfully. It plays beautifully, and it's got its own unique profile. That it's a very like mid-range heavy type of sound where it sounds awesome. And so how did you find that the maple ended up working as a top wood like that?
And it's ultimately it all leads to R&D, right? Where does that R&D fall? Or research and development, right? And where does it fall? Interestingly enough, one of my first instruments that I ever made was an all maple instrument.
Wow. Cool.
Right? And I loved the sound then.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, it's got brightness, it's got kick.
Yeah.
I'm a strummer, I'm digging in, and it's singing, to me, at least as far as tone, it was fitting, right? And at that point, I didn't have a lot of experience with koa even, or a lot of experience with mahogany and, some other tone woods that we built from today, but the maple really fit. So it was really exciting when, Kaimana working alongside with Kahiao and their kind of vision of what we could do with some like really, really killer maple, and then ultimately creating, our ilikai and the pohaku series, which in turn gave us a whole nother tone that was so unique, but not too unfamiliar either, because it was a sound that I really, really loved. So, having that kind of as a success, and then now, of course, adding it with our Pro Series and doing true reduction and bringing some of the practices that we're able to do today in relieving mass and ultimately creating this really unique tone. I think that was a wonderful deep dive, even though it was kind of on a surface of some of the alternative tone woods. I think it took us to places that will help to bring some insight to our students.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think one more thing to add is that more than any of the wood, the builder makes the biggest difference. I think that all too often people think, oh, I need a spruce and koa uke. And then they start going online and they look up all the different, they just go through spruce and koa and they pick a company because it was the spruce and koa instead of it being the company. Every ukulele manufacturer has their unique sound. And I think it's really important to find that unique sound that works well for you. And with Kanileʻa, that's been my favorite part of playing Kanileʻa ukuleles is the consistency that you find in your tone. And so I find that in Kanileʻa I can hear more of a difference with different tone woods because your process is so carefully curated and consistent that your wood density and your thickness and everything else will, if it's a cedar Kanileʻa, I probably could have a blind test and know it's a cedar Kanileʻa because of the consistency that you have as a builder combined with that flavor profile of cedar. So for anyone watching, I think don't get too obsessed with just the wood. Pay attention to the builder and make sure that you find the right fit as a combination of those two things, which,
Absolutely. And with respect to the other builders, a cedar top of their instrument is still going to sound different than a cedar top of ours.
Absolutely, two of your ukuleles will sound more similar with different woods than two ukuleles from another company where these have the same set of woods. You'll be able to hear a Kanileʻa sound
Yes.
you know, a mile away. And that's exactly what makes it so special is, you know, finding those sounds for you.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, again, mahalo, Matt. It
Yeah,
was
thanks
awesome
so
that we were
much.
able to just talk story.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Appreciate
for bringing the ideas and the concepts and the things that you see as a teacher, you know, to the builder to say, hey, these are some of my students' concerns or the things that the questions that come up a lot in guiding which way for them to start to just take a look at.
Yeah.
And, you know, ultimately, you know, surfing through, listening to your videos, listening through what you do as far as an artist, and you're able to bring those tones out. And then for, you know, a player, you can start to really start to look at what tones you're looking for. And then you start to dial those kind of
What are their
features
goals
in.
and where are they at right now? Where do they want to be, and matching the instrument with that? And
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think, again, it's awesome. It's awesome that we're able to just talk story like this.
Absolutely. It's always a great time.
Some tone talk.
Tone talk.
I love it. Well, mahalo again for listening in. I think you guys are going to have some questions that develop from this. So please don't hesitate. Reach out either in the comments and or, you know, drop us a line if you have any questions to either of us as far as tone goes. And, you know, check us out in the future when we start to do more of these tone talks, because I really enjoy talking story like this. So everyone take care and aloha.